Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College coming to you with another video. This time we're looking at human development, the first 2 years, and we'll be looking at cognitive development and language development in this video. Let me get a pointer on the screen so that I can indicate where I am as we're going through this, and once we have that, we'll get started. Okay, so we're going to start by having a look at Piaget's theory of cognitive development and how it applies to this age period. And so as he uh, observed children, he concluded that the first couple years of kids' life was primarily development of cognition through taking in sensory information and through moving around and encountering new things in their environment. So he referred to this first couple years as the sensorimotor period. So the main idea is infants then learn by using their senses and motor skills. This period then could be divided into 6 stages, which then can also be grouped into 3 substages, if you will. So stages 1 and 2, the infant is simply responding to feedback, sensory feedback that he's getting or she's getting from their own body. In stage 3 and 4, then they are responding to feedback that is also coming from other people and from objects in their environment. Stage 5 and 6, there is feedback through active exploration of their environment, and they also get feedback about their environment by experimenting with things that they encounter, experimenting with various ideas that they have. So you can see that there's a terrific progression here from very simple your own body until actually actively being involved with your environment. So just to give a quick breakdown of each of those stages, he called the first stage that of reflexes from birth to 1 month. And here the child is engaging in just reflexive actions, as we talked about earlier, inborn actions like sucking and grasping things, listening as well. This provides information. Their senses and movement then interact to wire up those neural networks, as we spoke of in the first portion of this chapter. And as they are then wiring up, at first, those reflexes are just the basic inborn reflex, not yet altered for specific purposes, but as those neural networks are formed, we will find that we go into stage 2, which he called the first acquired adaptation. So between 1 and 4 months, then they're moving from just reflexive movements to intentional movements. Now they're beginning to get voluntary control over their body. And as they do, they then also are having new experiences. And so we can also see it evident that they have various intentions as well in moving their body. Now, here's an example of how that happens. Let's have a look at the sucking reflex. Initially, first month of life, babies will suck on anything you put in their mouth. Now, let's say we have a baby who has been breastfeeding and now they're given a bottle to feed from. Well, they're very quickly adapt to them through that process of assimilation that I told you about in chapter 1. And they've already got a category, things that you can suck on and get nutrition, and the bottle fits right in. So they readily adapt to that. Now, let's say we give them now something new, a pacifier. Here, they're going to need to engage in a new process, that of accommodation. They're going to have to actually come up with a new category because as they suck on that pacifier, they find it provides no nutrition. So now you have a new category that has to be formed, things that you can suck on that are for other purposes, like to soothe yourself. And you might also have to adapt that reflexive sucking in order to actually enjoy that pacifier. You have to modify that reflexive motion in order to enjoy it, since there's not going to be any milk coming from it. You don't have to swallow all the time. So this indicates that they now are beginning to interpret the sensory information that's coming in. And so processes of perception are going on, as well as just taking in information. And you might say it seems to be a primitive form of thinking where categories are being formed as well. So on we go to stage 3. Between age 4 and 8 months, Piaget refers to this now as the awareness of things. So the child becomes more aware of their environment surrounding them. They engage in more activity because now their motor skills enable them to move around more readily, and they begin interacting with things in their environment. So they don't have yet, they're not able to yet really get a sense of cause and effect, but they are able to learn how to make interesting or pleasing events last. For example, they may not be able to, at this point, figure out how to get mom to come over there to play with them when they want it. But one thing they have figured out is once mom is there and she's playing with them and smiling, what can I do to keep that going? Oh, I can respond to that, and she will stay there longer with me and continue to play. So they do get that. They also will manipulate things, handle them to try to learn about their qualities, and they will interact with people as well, and through that begin learning about their environment. So then we come to stage 4, which he calls new adaptations and anticipation. So between 8 and 12 months, what you see emerging is more evident goal-directed behavior, having the goal to accomplish some end and working to do so. And at this point, then you can also see them forming a connection of cause and effect by various actions and the reactions that occur as a result of those behaviors. So, for example, goal-directed behavior. Well, maybe they they see that mom is picking up her keys and she's putting on her jacket. Well, they recognize that this is what she does when she goes somewhere, and so their goal might be that mom would take them along. So having had some experience with this, they recognize that if they hold on to mom's jacket, hold on to her pant leg or whatever as they're crawling along there, yeah, maybe she'll actually decide that she'll take them along. And so they'll repeat that action knowing that that behavior has caused the desired effect. Also, we see in this memory of previous experience the recognition that when mom picks up her keys and puts on her jacket, she's going somewhere. So we know that they have memory of specific actions. One of the big advances that Piaget noted was the development of object permanence. So object permanence is the recognition that things still exist even when you can't see them, and that they retain their properties generally, even when they happen to be invisible to you. Now, Piaget believed that children didn't develop this capability till they were about 8 months, but recent research has indicated that this may occur as early as 4.5 months. So I want to show you a video that describes this, and let me see if I can skip to this video here. get it going for you. It also shows you a little bit about how Piaget did experiments as well on this, so that helps you get a more about that too.
Loses its appeal. This decrease in response to any repeated event is known as habituation. When the baby responds to another stimulus in a way that shows it perceives that stimulus to be different, the response is known as dishabituation. Together, habituation and dishabituation are one key to understanding a baby's mental processes. Researchers use the amount of time a baby spends looking at objects and its heart rate as measures of attention, preferences, or perceptual ability. Changes in the rate of sucking, smiling, sticking out the tongue, and crying can also be used to measure a response to different events. In 1958, psychologist Robert Fance started the tradition of using a baby's preference for looking at something new as a form of silent speech. Fance also observed that babies preferred objects that have contours to those that are plain, complex ones over simple ones, and whole faces over parts of faces that are jumbled up. But the researcher who most contributed to our understanding of what children know is Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget.
La période préscolaire est, psychologiquement parlant, une période tout à fait fondamentale.
Piaget didn't use fancy lab equipment, but rather simple demonstrations that yielded generalizations about the workings of a child's mind. Consider how a child understands that when the appearance of something changes, it doesn't necessarily mean that the object itself has changed. In one of Piaget's demonstrations, two of the same size glasses are filled with equal amounts of colored liquid. The contents of one of the glasses is poured into a tall container.
Now, would you say that there's the same amount of juice in the two cups? Or does one have more, or does the other have more?
This one has more.
This one has more?
Yeah.
Why do you say that one has more?
Because it's skinnier.
6-year-olds believe that the tall container now has more liquid than the glass. 7-year-olds are uncertain, and 8-year-olds know that despite appearances, nothing has really changed.
Because this glass is just taller, but so you just done just to call it just have in here and pour it in there.
Fine.
And that just filled it up, but the only thing is still the same amount.
Good. That's very good thinking.
The amount of colored liquid remains the same, no matter what container it's in. Its volume is conserved. But for all the value of Piaget's work, he, like many others, underestimated the age at which children develop various skills, because he confused their physical ability with their ability to understand. Often, children's mental functioning develops before their ability to make a certain physical response. At the University of Illinois, a team of researchers is now using ingenious experiments to discover previously unsuspected abilities of newborns and young children.
3 months, 23 days.
Professor René Baillargeon studies how babies develop the concept of object permanence.
By object permanence, we mean really a set of beliefs about objects. The first and most fundamental belief is that objects continue to exist when hidden. The first person to investigate the development of object permanence beliefs in infants was Jean Piaget, the famous Swiss psychologist. And he claimed that it's not until approximately 8 to 9 months of age that infants understand that objects continue to exist when hidden, and that it's not until approximately 12 months of age that babies begin to understand that objects not only exist but retain their physical and spatial properties when hidden. What we've done is to devise a series of tasks where the infant simply had to look at possible and impossible events.
In this experiment, a 6-month-old baby watches a cart rolling down tracks, going behind a screen and coming out the other side. The screen is lifted to show a block sitting behind the tracks. Next, the baby sees the block placed on top of the tracks. The The screen comes down, the cart rolls exactly as before. But in the real world of permanent objects, the block should have stopped the cart. The baby stares longer at this apparently impossible event.
When infants are surprised or puzzled by an event, they tend to look at it longer. So our prediction is always that if infants perceive the events as we do, then they will look longer at the impossible or magical event than at the possible event. And what we found is that infants as young as 3.5 months of age, and perhaps younger, but certainly as young as 3.5 months of age, understand that objects continue to exist when hidden. One contribution of this research is to say that we must really take a very close look at infants' physical knowledge. It's much richer, much more sophisticated than used to be thought.
So there you go. And so as you look at that, yeah, notice that Professor Bejan came up with a very different answer to the question as to when children can experience object permanence. Why did she have a different conclusion than Piaget? Well, because she tested for that ability in a way that children could readily respond to. Piaget's tests, often the younger child was not able to make the response he was looking for. In Piaget's tests, he would hide an object in the child's presence and then wait to look and see if the child would search for it and would look underneath items for it and so forth, things that younger children were not really capable of doing. So when a measure was used that children could do at a younger age, then we see their capability to recognize that things exist. We can't see them. So this is, happens with Piaget on occasion, although the general progression that he indicates from his observations is generally correct. There are sometimes some errors, mostly along the lines of underestimating children's abilities. Okay, so moving on then from there, then we would find the fifth stage, active experimentation between age 1 year and 18 months. The child again is motivated to produce various results. Goal-directed activity results in greater creativity. And so they will just take things and experiment with them. They'll do things just to see what will happen if they do that. So sometimes Piaget referred to the child at this age as a little scientist. So, they just might put the cat in the clothes dryer just to see what will happen, They will just take things and do stuff with them just to, what else can I do with that? So my food bowl, what else can I do with it? Oh, maybe I could wear it as a hat. And then you see their food all over the room. So this type of activity at this point, though, is trial and error. Okay, so they don't think it through ahead of time per se. They're just trying different things. And this is also the age where parents will say the child is just getting into everything. So that's kind of important to know. Because at that age, they'll try things not knowing that they could be dangerous. That light socket over there on the wall, that outlet, yeah, they'll stick their fingers in there just to see what will happen, not knowing that they're going to light up as a result. So you have to protect them from that. That's why we have child-proof things, especially for kids this age. Okay, so they're experimenting with things, trying out things to see what will happen. Finally, stage 6, that of mental combinations. And so at this point, 1.5 to 2 years, they now begin to think through actions before they actually go into the action. And so they can solve a problem mentally first before going into that action. Let me give you an example. So there's a cookie on the shelf way above the counter in the kitchen, and they want that cookie. So you will see the child maybe sitting around there in the kitchen and looking at the various items in the kitchen, trying to figure out how they could get that cookie. And then after looking at various things for a while, suddenly they go into action and they grab a stool and climb up on that, and then they get another chair next to that so they can get from the stool to the chair, and then that gets them up onto the counter and so forth until they get the cookie. But they've thought it all through first, and that's how it explains how that can happen so quick when you're not looking sometimes. So not only can they mentally solve problems before actually acting now, they can also pretend, which suggests that they do also are producing mental images of things. So they can pretend that a doll represents a person, or that a toy truck represents an actual vehicle, symbolic thinking, you might say. They also will engage in deferred imitation. So when they see an action being done, they may, some significant time later, imitate that action. They might see mom making a sandwich, and a couple days later, they might try to make a sandwich themselves, try to imitate that action. So that shows also that memory capability is developing as well. So there you go. Now that's Piaget's take on it. Let's now have a look at also infant cognition, that is information processing, looking at it through the lens of more modern research as well. So much of modern cognitive research kind of compares how our brains process information to how computers do so. So we're looking at things like memory and speed of processing and that sort of thing. So when it comes to infant memory, now classical developmental theory held that children don't form any memories through that first year. What we're going to find is there is evidence of memory during this time, although it's kind of limited. So what experiments have shown is that infants can and do remember tasks. However, the experiments to do this must follow a number of guidelines. First of all, the conditions of the experiment have to be similar to something that a child would encounter in real life. The task that the child has to do to indicate that they remember something has to be something that they're highly motivated for. And then children this age require special measures to aid memory retrieval. So let me give you a quick summary of one classic experiment that demonstrated infant memory. So what they did is they had a group of infants that they gathered to be participants in this and divided them into two groups. Um, in the beginning, they put the babies down in a crib, let them lay there, and then they tracked how many times within a certain time period they kicked their leg. So this gave them kind of a baseline measurement of how frequent is leg kicking behavior under normal circumstances. What they then did is they tied the baby's foot to a mobile. Mobile is that thing, kind of thing you can put it above in a crib, and it's got some kind of figures there. And if you disturb it, they'll move around. And as you saw in the video, babies enjoy seeing things that are moving and changing. So they're highly motivated to see that thing move around. Well, what they found is the babies quickly learned that kicking their foot caused that mobile to move. And so the rate of foot kicking increased tremendously as they learned that. So they then took the babies out of that situation once they had learned how to kick their foot to see the mobile move. And then they, with one group, simply brought them back a week later and again attached their foot to the mobile to see would they remember what to do. Did they remember? Well, the answer is no, they didn't remember what to do. After a week, they had forgotten. Okay, so that's the babies that a week went by and nothing was done in between. The other half of the babies, during that week between when they first encountered the mobile and the end of the week, they simply brought them in and showed them the crib and the mobile halfway through the week, midway through the week. They didn't attach their foot to the mobile, none of that. They just showed it to them and then took them back out. At the end of the week, when they did bring them in and attach their foot to the mobile, these babies immediately knew what to do. So they referred to that visit where they saw the apparatus. Again, they referred to it as a reminder session and found that that reminder session was sufficient to reinforce their memory. So the conclusion of that in many different experiments is yes, infants can remember specific tasks and so forth. However, the memory is somewhat fragile and requires reinforcement and re-exposure to the situations frequently in order for it to persist any length of time. Now, by the end of their first year, memory ability has improved significantly, and now they can engage in that deferred imitation that I mentioned earlier. So in an experiment, babies this age watched a man on TV playing with a toy, and when given a toy days later, they immediately knew what to do with the toy. They also can imitate more complex procedures that they've seen earlier when they get to about a year and a half and on up. So in one experiment, they also found that the ability to imitate those procedures was aided by language development. So here's how this experiment went. Okay, so in the experiment, the object was to have the child, the toddler, to put water on a table, spray water on it, then wipe it up and toss away the tissue. So half of the children simply saw an adult do those actions and then they were asked to repeat it. The other half of the children saw the adult do those actions, and as they did the actions, they accompanied it with verbal instructions. You know, they said, put on the water, wipe it off, toss it as they were doing the actions. What they found out is kids who had the verbal instructions along with the visual example were much more capable then of reproducing the procedure than those who simply saw it and didn't hear that. So language development is helping them. They also at this point are able to begin generalizing and transfer learning from one situation to similar situations. So the situation no longer has to be exactly the same for them to know what to do. Now we take up language development in the first couple of years. And as we look at this, you know, the earliest communications of children, it's hard to figure out. You know, babies, newborns, it's pretty hard. Either they're screaming because they're not happy and they need something, or they're pretty much silent, although eventually you kind of get some cooing when they're in a good mood and that sort of thing, but it's very limited. Uh, as time goes on, though, there is tremendous development here. Now, in terms of our communication with babies, Most often, adults will engage in child-directed speech. You know, think about that. How do you talk to a baby? You know, do you talk to them like I'm speaking now in a lecture? And you say, no way. We use kind of a high-pitched voice, and we use very simple sentences, very repetitive. Um, so why do we do that? Well, turns out there's a good reason. We do that because turns out babies prefer that. They'll listen to that. They'll be engaged by it, but they're not going to be much interested in my lecture. I guess either, but well, anyway. Um, so they've also found that children, this enables them to begin actually learning language more readily than if we confront them with a very complex language situations lecture is. So it helps them learn when we speak to them that way, at least early on. Now, if they're 18 years old and you're still doing that, they should be beyond that. But the first year or two, that child-directed speech is perfect for them. So some of the first then language-like sounds would be babbling. Between age 6 and 9 months, they'll make these language-type sounds. They're not words, but just combinations of sounds, and they'll do this repetitively. What's interesting is this appears to be completely built in. Even babies that are completely deaf will begin making these sounds, although they will stop doing them much sooner than children who have hearing. What's also interesting about those babies who are deaf is if they are around people who do sign language, those deaf babies will begin to make movements with their fingers that they look like actual signing. They're not real signs, but they look like that. So they appear to be babbling in sort of sign-like language. So it kind of shows you how built in circuits are for language and how we might even try to adapt to overcome obstacles to that. So the first words, then the first actual words that babies speak usually come around about a year, which is kind of nice because you can remember a year first word, a year walking for most kids. Their spoken vocabulary then begins building up first with 1 or 2 new words a week and accelerating, especially when they get to a vocabulary of 50 or more words, they begin then piling on 50 to 100 new words a month. So the vocabulary is building rapidly. And around 18 months is when we see this naming explosion, as they call it, happen. And children rapidly increase their behavior even faster at this point. And maybe you've been around kids that age and you'll notice they will be asking you, what's this called? What's that? And you're constantly having to name everything for them. And what they're learning at this time in terms of language is primarily nouns. They seem to be geared to pick up nouns, although you will find in cultures where their language is more action oriented or is more relationship oriented, they will pick up a greater percentage of other parts of speech like verbs, but still it's predominantly nouns. So rapid increases of vocabulary going on. Now, so far though, their communication is through single word sentences, what we call a hollow phrase. Single word has to express the complete thought. So how do they get their message across with just one word? Well, sometimes what they use the tone of voice and inflection to try to indicate what they want, or they may use gesturing to try to accompany that one word, but they're doing their best to communicate. Now a big advance comes in. Around 21 months on average, the child begins to combine words into multi-word sentences. And they very quickly also begin figuring out that the way the words are ordered, matters, so that hit Billy means something different than Billy hit. They also begin picking up the syntax of the language. That's, what endings do you put on the words? In English, if there's more than one thing, if it's plural, you kind of put that S sound on the word mostly, right? So just mostly on their own, they become relatively proficient in communicating through language by age 2. Multi-word sentences being produced. That's pretty amazing. So let's just take a moment and consider bilingual language development. So especially in our part of the country where often children are, they are exposed to both English and Spanish. Sometimes parents worry that that will confuse the child and that they will be impaired in their language development as a result. And turns out that's not the case. Turns out that hearing more than one language doesn't impair language development, particularly if we take care for a couple things. Okay, beings that um, half of what child hears will be in one language, half in the other. What we want to do is provide a language rich environment. And so a lot of communication with the child so that they get exposure to each language sufficient to get an understanding of it. So frequent repetition of words in each language is necessary, and exposure to more speech helps as well. And so if we pay some attention to that, also if we remain in one language for at least a sentence, that helps them as well. And they will figure out, they'll figure out what word goes to what language if we do that. So really actually beneficial. There have been some studies that indicate that this also actually leads to greater brain development, and so just really very beneficial. And if you're concerned about that, think about many places in the world, kids grow up speaking not just one language, but two languages, bilingual. Many places, children end up being trilingual or multilingual. And so those things should, that can be done, not a problem. Okay. So just how do children actually gain their ability with language? Well, one stance is that infants need to be taught. And so this is the belief of the behaviorists, learning theorists, who believe that we had to uh, have certain conditions for learning. For example, B.F. Skinner would point out that children learn language as parents reinforce babbling that sounded more and more like real words. And so through a process of rewarding, shaping the child's language sounds, then the parent would shape that into actual words. Also, we will note that if we repeatedly connect words with things and actions, the child does make an association between those things. And so classical conditioning, associating one event with another, one stimulus with another, that does appear to be one of the processes that's involved. So notice this approach would suggest that maternal responsiveness to the child's efforts at language is important. So the mom actually encouraging the child as they develop those abilities and guiding them to learn new words and make the connections. That's the behaviorist approach. Now, in contrast, We have also the stance that, well, language learning is innate. In other words, it's just built in. So that was the view of Noam Chomsky, promoted this viewpoint. He studied language development worldwide and found that kids would pick up the grammar of their language at roughly the same age, no matter what language it was. He also noted that all languages had some things in common, universal grammar, as he called it, like raising one's voice at the end of a question. So he proposed that our brain was equipped with some sort of language acquisition device, and there was just some built-in thing in our brain that was experience expected. Our brain expects to hear language and is just geared to decode it and to absorb language and the rules of language naturally. So my question to you is, well, which of these two approaches is correct? Well, my answer would be each approach may apply to different aspects of language learning. If you think about it, what part of language, um, what part of language do kids actually figure out on their own with no assistance at all from others? Well, they figure out the grammar of the language. Okay, think about it. Those first 2 years, as kids are learning to speak, we don't have to sit them down and say, okay, if you want to have a sentence, you got to have a subject and a verb, and this is a noun, and when you want a plural, you got to put a S on the end of the word, and past tense is this. We don't have to do that. They figure that out on their own. So in the area of grammar, syntax of the language, that seems to be what's covered by these innate mechanisms. Now, we could also say, on the other hand, that vocabulary development, that's one where actually teaching may be very beneficial. And so encouragement, reinforcement of learning new words and making connections, that's something we adults can actually help them with. So we might say really both aspects of it, um, but for different reasons. Okay, so a third view about language learning then kind of takes up the not how they learn the language, but well, why? And that would be that we as human beings are social beings. We have a strong impulse to communicate with others. We want to share our experiences and we want to communicate our needs and so on. So, language as a social tool enables us to develop our relationships and communicate with others. And so we are highly motivated to do so. So, there you go, language development the first couple of years. And that's all for today. So have a great day, and we'll talk to you next time.